Hello. For this episode of the AS for Architecture podcast, I spoke with Owen Hopkins, author, curator, and currently director of both the Farrell Centre at Newcastle University and one of the 5 curators of this year's British Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale. But nope, we don't talk about all that. Rather, our chat was on his incredibly recent book, The Manifesto House, Buildings That Changed the Future of Architecture, published by Yale University Press 2 days ago. Manifesto House explores the history of architecture through the lens of individual houses that have acted as, well, manifestos for new ideas, movements and ways of living, explored through 21 houses from the 16th to the 21st century. The book presents a compelling narrative of how individual homes can influence architecture's evolution and perhaps even answer some of the challenges we're faced with today.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of AS for Architecture. I'm talking today to Owen Hopkins. Owen, thank you for joining me. It's a real pleasure, and I'm delighted that we're going to be talking about your new book, The Manifesto House, Buildings That Changed the Future of Architecture. Owen, before we discuss that and the important issues, very fascinating issues it raises, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be speaking about the book. So my name is Owen Hopkins. I'm a curator and writer. When I'm not writing books, I'm the director of the Farrell Centre here in Newcastle, which is a still relatively new public centre for architecture and cities, with the mission to engage the broadest possible audience with the future of the built environment here in Newcastle, but also further afield too.
So what's the Farrell Centre addressing? Because it implicitly suggests that there's a problem, that people are not engaged.
There is, absolutely. And I think it's, we're not by any means the first to have noticed this problem. So the Farrell and the Farrell Centre is Terry Farrell, our founder, who established the centre with Newcastle University, which we are part of. And just over 10 years ago now, he was commissioned to do a review into UK's built environment by the then coalition government. Seems like a kind of age ago. And one of the many recommendations that Terry made was that places like the Farrell Centre needed to be established to connect local people to the decisions that are made that shape the built environment, because as he recognised, and so many others do, there is this huge disconnection between how the built environment is designed, how it is produced, and the people it actually affects, the people who live and work in those spaces. And our mission is to try to raise the profile of the built environment and hopefully create a situation whereby it's taken more seriously, and its role, its transformative role in pretty much everything. It becomes gets the place it requires in public policy making, not just in urban planning, but in pretty much everything.
It's a noble and almost millennial kind of interest, isn't it? Because at the turn of the millennium, there was all of this kind of interest in the built environment, and it does seem to have sort of gone on a back burner, particularly in relation to things like the drive to build more houses, where architecture seems to have architecture as a profession and as a kind of centralized profession as well through its professional bodies, seems to have a very limited agency.
Absolutely. As you say, so maybe it does. There's a slightly sort of retro quality to what we're doing in a sense, but yeah, you have to go back to New Labour really for a government that was actually interested in listening to what architects had to say. And obviously, Richard Rogers was one of the key people of the Urban Task Force, and before the idea of the urban renaissance that has been so transformative to so many cities. But obviously there was complete sort of reversal in 2010, and you had politicians like Michael Gove saying explicitly we wouldn't get architects like Richard Rogers to design your schools, and it was almost a kind of anti-architecture moment. And I think we've not really moved on from that in many ways. And looking to the present now, Labour again, their government, their ambition to build 1.5 million new homes over the course of the current parliament, which they're never going to reach. Architects are barely part of that discussion, which is a real shame, not just for their own sake, but actually for the quality of what's going to be produced.
Yeah, it's kind of insane, but it's kind of, I suppose it's self-selection as well, isn't it? Like we've started to talk ourselves out of the conversation. I was looking at Tim Abrams. He posted on Instagram quote from a recent podcast episode that he's made with Patrick Schumacher. And obviously, Mr. Schumacher is a controversial figure by design, perhaps. And he's made this point about architecture sort of disappearing. The reality of architecture's disappearance is the quote. It shows the reality of architecture's disappearance. And it seems to me, and this comes to your book, that the first place that we've sort of disappeared from is actually in the construction of housing and the definition of homes. And I'm kind of fascinated by that. Does that feature as an aspect of what the Farrell Centre does? Sort of try to engage people at the level of their experience of the built environment, which is predominantly residential.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're trying to find ways to connect with, as I say, as broad an audience as possible, not just reach people who are already interested in architecture or somehow involved in the various associated professions.
Mm.
So it is trying to find ways to connect to people through how they experience the built environment. And as you say, it's often through, domestic residential spaces. Those are the spaces that we spend the most time in, that have probably the most sort of significant impact on our lives. So yes, absolutely. It's, for us, the mission is trying to take architecture, planning, these to many people, these very elitist, rarefied professions and discourses, and trying to find ways to connect to actually how people understand and think about and use and experience the built environment. And actually, I've always, this has kind of informed all of the work that I've ever done across my career, is that architecture as a profession, as a discipline, sees itself, has arguably always done, but particularly in the 20th century, as somehow different to other disciplines that help shape the built environment. And it is its role in mediating between private interests and public effect of buildings. And architects, I think they are contracted by clients or by I suppose with design and build, by the construction industry to deliver projects. But there's always the sort of the architecture, the thinking expands beyond what the contractual obligations are, to think more broadly about the role of this building in its place in the city, in the world. And it's kind of that sort of exceptionalism that architecture has is I think increasingly it's increasingly getting lost, but at the same time it's losing, unless you actually involve the public, the people who are building for, in the discourses that are otherwise internal to the discipline, then actually that public mission has no real meaning or no real merit. So for me, it's absolutely fundamental to architecture as a discipline, planning, arguably even more so, that actually the public are connected to it, that they're not just told this is what's going to happen or this is the best way of doing things. They're actually invited in and are part of the conversation. That's what we're trying to do here at the Farrell Centre. It's incredibly difficult to do, of course, and it's expensive to do, but hugely worthwhile. And I think, coming back to your previous point, that sort of the marginalization of architects, particularly in housing, the sort of, I guess, going back to, I don't keep talking about Michael Gove, but that was that idea that actually architects and architecture adds costs. It adds stuff that you don't need. It's kind of almost the kind of luxurious thing. And that is incredibly damaging, because sometimes design, a good design building costs a little bit more than a badly designed building, although not always the case. There are plenty of incredibly expensive, badly designed buildings around. But also, if one is thinking about it even in purely sort of crudely economic terms, good design, well-designed buildings, well-designed urban spaces contribute financially to contribute to the economy in ways that are really positive. So actually, the good design will more than pay for itself
Mm.
if one is looking at it in those terms. But we shouldn't just look at it in economic terms, because obviously it has a much broader, bigger role.
Yeah. It's a very interesting idea, and it's kind of a cute idea, this idea that architecture can be effective. And, the simple way I think about it is it's much more expensive in the medium and long run to build bad buildings, bad housing particularly, literally on the physiological health of people. And it seems remarkable that we leave housing development to private corporations, and almost it would, I mean, I don't know, but it seems to me to be almost no oversight at all. But I want to come back to your story. You're not an architect yourself, but how did you get to architecture? What drew you to this? And perhaps we can segue into thinking about this book as well, because you've been writing since, I mean, you published your first book 13 years ago.
Uh, yeah, 2012. Yes, goodness. Yeah.
2012, reading architectural visual lexicon, which you published with
Now,
others,
now
I
in
think.
now in its second edition, I should add.
Yes, yes, now in its second edition, because it's published in 2023 as well. And you've written a lot. So what drew you to architecture? For me, it's because it's amazing, but for you, why?
Well, I suppose it's that as well. But just I guess the story is, I mean, it's not an especially interesting one, really. I studied art history at university, mainly because I didn't really know what to do, and my art teacher said, "Oh, go and do art history. You're interested in history, and you've done sort of science as well. So actually, there's a way that this discipline can bring these interests together." And actually, that's the sort of wonderful thing about art history, is that it's not just one discipline or one subject. There are many different forms of art history. And during those years, I was assigned a course on English Baroque architecture, which I knew literally nothing about at the time. Knew who Christopher Wren was, but that was it. And then was sort of just doing some initial readings, flicking through, I remember what book it was, some survey book, and then saw a photograph of Hawksmoor's churches,
Mhm.
and was just kind of bowled over by these buildings, and then even more so that they were just a kind of a few miles down the road. And whether it was that day or whether it was later in the week or whatever, I went to see them, and that was the kind of the moment where I suddenly realized actually what what architecture was, and what it could be, and the role it plays in the world. And I became fascinated by those buildings in particular, and why they came to look the way they do, which as ever is a kind of sort of triangulation between a kind of particular cultural moment, a sort of urban situation, but then the kind of the X factor is the architect themselves. So that really was how I became interested in architecture, and then it all went from there, and moved from a kind of interest in sort of that sort of particular historical moment, to kind of a much broader interest, although I suppose still remain at root a historian, have been trained as a historian, but now kind of practice as a writer, curator, critic, hopefully thinker about architecture as well.
Hopefully, we'll find out. No, I think that's what's very interesting about your output, is how diverse it's been, that you haven't focused on a particular moment. And perhaps this is partly because you're not restricted as an academic with a research profile that demands that you get grants in certain fields that you've published papers in. And so you have a much more broad spread. How did this book, Manifesto House, come about?
I can't quite remember the precise kind of when the idea kind of originated. To be honest, I mean, I've always been, I think you rightly kind of describe my output as quite wide ranging, and
Mm-hmm.
Ollie described me once as a generalist. I'm not sure if that was meant as a compliment or not, but I suppose it is a fairly good description. But across all of that work in different ways, I've always been, I mean, firstly interested in how not necessarily how architecture is made or produced, but how we see it,
Mm.
and to some degree, obviously, how we use it as well, and what sort of shapes that. And that was that, the interest in Hawksmoor culminated in a book which was kind of one part on Hawksmoor, one part on the kind of the history of his buildings after his death. So it's a story of an architect's and these buildings' reputation. Um, and sort of within that, I've always been interested in these moments of transition in architectural history, in architectural culture. I've done quite a lot of work on postmodernism, for example. I mean, the English Baroque moment, going back to that for a moment, is another of these kind of moments of transition when new ideas are put forward, things kind of come up for grabs in new ways. And, again, going back to the sort of art historical training, I've always been interested in this sort of idea of style and the trajectory of styles over time, and the way that you can see the history of architecture, particularly as this kind of oscillation between uh, these moments of transition, where sort of pluralism and almost sort of disorder becomes the sort of the thing that is most sort of prominent or most sort of defining about architectural culture at those particular moments, and then periods of conformity or particular trajectories achieving some kind of preeminence. So the Manifesto House was fitted into both those sort of recurring interests in many ways, in that it was an attempt to try to sort of tell a discontinuous story of the history of architecture through these particular houses that mark these moments in time, to some extent when things came up for grabs, but also when architects had the opportunities to build, and to build in such a way that those houses would encapsulate their ideas for what architecture might become in the future. So it's a kind of, as I say, it's a discontinuous narrative. It's a sort of, rather than a tale that continues in one single thread, it's almost a kind of series of threads kind of going leading off in different directions.
Mm. It's sort of like a mosaic, really. You've kind of created a historical patchwork or mosaic of instance, but you gather them together into three like principal areas. You've got these three: looking back, looking out, and looking forward. These kind of three zones of buildings that have engaged with historical tradition, buildings that have engaged with nature, I suppose, and buildings that have engaged with kind of futurism, which I think is a really elegant way of doing it. The challenge that presents is how do people kind of use that to measure against other buildings against it in a way? It's kind of easy in a chronology, in a normal history. We can say that we are in a kind of evolutionary process, but you're not talking about an evolutionary process, that there's this kind of unpacking of the human condition or technological process. It's a much more granular picture than that.
Yes. I mean, I don't know how kind of useful those categories are, and obviously you can take issue with them. You can put number of the uh, houses in different categories. You can put them in more than one. You could put them in all of them, or maybe arguably none as well. But I guess one of the fundamental tasks of the historian, and also potentially of the curator as well, is of categorizing things, of trying to take this mass and put forward some ideas or mechanisms by which you can begin to make sense of it in
Mm-hmm.
different ways. And I was very keen to resist a linear narrative. I mean, books are linear things. That's the sort of the
Mm.
definition of them. And obviously, there's been long histories of books that are written in such ways that are try to evade that.
Mm.
But and from a kind of point of view of a sort of historical story, we know we've been told these sort of familiar stories of architecture's trajectory, which
Mm-hmm.
which are kind of very kind of modernist in inflected. And I wanted to do something that didn't necessarily say that, well, this is all rubbish and we should reject it and sort of start again, but actually took those trajectories and thought, well, how can we actually make them more complicated
Mm-hmm.
and more kind of attuned to what is actually much more of a kind of a staccato rhythm than any kind of sort of smooth or regular or ordered journey. I mean, I don't quite know why I've kind of always been interested in these kinds of things, but this is the kind of way of thinking about architecture and art history that I think remains deeply unfashionable. My when I was at university 20 years ago, it was the sort of school of I guess what had emerged in the 1980s, a sort of social art history of a kind of art history that's rooted in, I guess, it's a sort of materialist approach to art history and questions of styles, were sort of suggested as being anachronistic, and in many ways they are. And I'm not, I never kind of advocate going back to sort of 19th century sort of Hegelian ideas of style almost as something that has its own life and has its own kind of trajectory independent of material factors, economic forces, individuals in some ways. But I think I'm kind of fascinated by how, notwithstanding those obvious and necessary reservations, there's still something to be said about how ideas and approaches sort of come up and then subside, and what drives that. So and which is factors that are rooted in
Yeah.
In sort of economics and they're socially grounded very often.
It's a sort of differential between the Bannister Fletcher tree of the knowledge of architecture on the front page of his glorious late 19th century, 1896 or 1903 or something like that, versus the Jenksian evolutionary diagram, that kind of sideways lava lamp of stuff happening, which I quite like. Before we get into the idea of the Manifesto House, you make a point of stating that you are dealing with houses, not homes. What does that mean?
Yeah, you've read the book carefully, which is great. Yes, I mean that's a distinction I make quite early on, and I think is an important one, because I sort of argue that you can make a home anywhere. A home, you can be at home in a house, but you can be at home in a city, in a country, in a place, you can also be at home in a cafe or a bar or a library or whatever. So home is something that emerges through our identity, a sense of belonging, through a connection we have to a particular place that's shaped by sort of social, cultural factors. That is kind of sort of rooted in memory to some extent. But for me, a house is something that can be a home, and very often they are homes, not always. But it's something that is constructed. It's a sort of synthetic structure that emerges from a set of ideas about how we might live, how we might conduct our day-to-day existence, and how critically that's then expressed to the world. And maybe that's a kind of good definition of architecture itself. But it's that almost that kind of that sort of primordial soup of different uses, affordances, functions, cultural and social norms that are kind of brought to the boil and then create some sort of manifestation of themselves that express those ideals. And that's, for me, ultimately what a house is, and why I think the house is so interesting in the history of architecture, because it it is something that is, it's not necessarily universal, and that's the sort of, anything that's universal is inherently quite sort of problematic as an idea or a thing or as a proposition, but has some kind of continuity. Kind of houses are a bit like coins. I think you can trace their lineage back across millennia, and there is a kind of consistency as to what a house is fundamentally. So that's why, for me, it became a kind of a vehicle, I suppose, for these ideas. And but of course, I'm not the first person who's noticed these architects in the book. Most of them have realized the possibilities that the house offers as these embodiments for their ideas for the future of architecture, as I describe it.
Yes, that's a very interesting point. I like that a lot. I was doing a project one time about home, and I struggled to find very much on home because it seems also, unlike house, perhaps because of this character that you describe, very difficult to grasp. It sort of happens when the door closes rather than in public. And so for scholars and researchers into these things, it's very difficult to define. So instead we have books on houses, very sexy books on houses, with no people in them, preferably, because that really makes the photographs mucky. So how do you define a manifesto house? How do you find a manifesto house? There's two questions, really.
Well, maybe I've covered the house bit, but so the manifesto. Oh yeah, yes, a manifesto is usually it's usually a text, traditionally speaking, usually relatively short, and it is hopefully a pithy, catchy representation of a proposition for usually for change, or a proposition at least of a position, political, cultural, social, that is different to the status quo. I think that's the fundamental thing. It's a proposition fundamentally for change or for doing something differently, and it's a response usually to not always need, although sometimes it is a response to need, but a kind of identification on the part of the person or sort of party putting forward the manifesto that something needs to change, that there is a requirement for this manifesto. So the kind of manifesto house as a thing is I guess they all emerge to some extent from a kind of analysis almost of the present situation or conditions of architecture and how buildings are designed and made, and they are proposals for doing things differently. And that's what all the houses are to some extent. Now, some of them were almost conceived explicitly as manifesto houses, although I don't necessarily find any of the architects using that phrase, but that's more or less what they are. And then there are others which are more kind of implicit manifestos, that they are, in some instances, quite sort of radical houses that stand actually as manifestos for doing architecture, in some instances, quite fundamentally differently. So there's a sort of distinction between those kind of self-conscious manifestos and maybe more of those implicit and unconscious manifestos.
A question I was writing down as you were speaking earlier was, which I perhaps should have put in my questions to you when I sent them over. A manifesto does imply that someone's got an intention to propose, as you say, a change. To what extent are the manifesto houses sort of intentionally a manifesto? What agency does the architect have in this process as well? So in these wonderful examples, and I think it's 21 examples you document in the book, all the way from Palladio's Villa Rotonda all the way through to more recent examples, the most recent one being, now you're going to have to excuse me here as I flick through the book, but I think the most recent one is in the 2000s, isn't it? Yeah, 2020, Krista Kim's Mars House, which is a virtual object. And, you've got Sue Fujimoto's House NA as well in 2012, so some 21st century. So in terms of them as manifestos, it implies that the architect has an ideology, an idea to push. Have you found that in your writing this book? Have you found that to be true? Or is this really a manifestation of a client's idea? Or is it some kind of co-production of the two?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. They are, I think, all of the houses are at root manifestations of their architects' ideas and the agendas that they're putting forward. And I think, what distinguishes a manifesto house from a manifesto, because some of these architects wrote sort of de facto manifestos as well, is that the house is the kind of enaction of that, in a sense, or at least it's, even if the manifesto is for kind of redesigning whole cities fundamentally, or it has a planetary kind of scope, in a sense. The house, and I wanted it to be houses that were actually built, shows how that might unfold in practice, and that, I think, was kind of as critical to the idea, is that it's the house itself as the manifesto. It's not necessarily a kind of proxy for a text. But of course, you mentioned the client, and all architects, for the most part, need clients. I mean, there is a kind of history of architects designing houses for themselves that are kind of manifesto houses, and there's a couple of examples in the book, but most of them aren't, and most of those architects to deliver these houses, which are by definition going against the grain or doing something new, are often very experimental, spatially, materially, in terms of the kind of the sort of the social dynamics that houses, almost kind of impose upon their occupants, required literally the buy-in of the clients as the sponsors, as the patrons, as the enablers, in some ways, of these architects' ideas and dreams. So very often there is this kind of meeting of minds, or clients that are in awe of their architects to the extent that they're happy to let them do they trust their instinct, they trust their genius, almost, to use another kind of unfashionable phrase, to create something that actually will be really significant, even if it ends up maybe being not always the most sort of practical or functional house.
Really cold.
Often, yes, maybe that. I mean, there's probably another way of doing this book, of kind of looking at houses that ended up being really, really cold and and unpleasant to live in. Because I mean that's often the price you pay for architectural innovations. Things don't always work, and that's going back to where we started this conversation. That is, architecture is sort of held back by this incredibly risk-averse world that we live in, and obviously that's, we don't want, we need to manage risk carefully, and we need buildings that are fundamentally safe and sound and are not going to endanger their inhabitants. That is, the architect's chief responsibility, of without any question. But at the same time, that's almost taken over to such an extent that we won't embrace any ideas for doing anything new, except within very kind of guarded and closely managed and sort of regulated and policed little kind of silos, little zones of freedom that exist. And you see this sort of manifest in buildings where you can kind of see, well, look, that's the bit that the architect did. That's the sort of design, in inverted commas, and the rest has basically been designed by spreadsheet. I've wondered whether it might be fun, or maybe fun for me, maybe less so for the students, but to do an architecture studio where we don't do any drawing, we design through using a spreadsheet. And those little zones of freedom that you can carve out based on these like very tight parameters that are kind of within a sort of design and build contract. Where can you find the spaces where you can kind of do something a little bit differently? I suspect I probably won't get too many students interested in that, but as a kind of intellectual exercise,
Yeah.
potentially quite an interesting and revealing one in terms of the where things are, the culture of architecture right now.
Yeah, for sure. I am interested in this character of your book, and you haven't cited any examples yet. And perhaps since I have controversially claimed that they might all be very, very cold or very hot, in depending on where we are in the world, I'd like you to perhaps give some examples where you feel the idea of the manifesto has been most explicitly revealed in some of these architectural examples, these house examples, and whether that was an emergent quality of the house, or whether that was something that has then emerged through the living in of that building. And I'm thinking here, of course, of Sir John Soane House in the museum in central London, which it looks like it's, an organically emerged manifesto, perhaps, as compared with, say, for example, Fujimoto's House NA in Tokyo, which clearly is a complete vision to begin with.
That's an interesting question. Yeah, so I guess the houses that have kind of become manifestos versus the ones sort of conceived explicitly as
Mm,
yeah, I mean the same museum features in the book. It kind of had to in a way, and you
yeah,
know going back to the sort of origins of this book, I worked there for 3.5 years or so, and it's a building that I kind of know pretty well. It's also one that you never really know fully. It's always sort of showing you new things. I mean, there's also a cliche to say something like that in a way, but actually having spent a considerable amount of time there, it is kind of true. It's always kind of revealing new secrets and new perspectives. And that, what I was struck by and kind of quite fully registered when I took the job there is the extent to which it is this almost this sort of pilgrimage shrine for architects from all over the world. It's where all the kind of London architecture students go in week one, year one. But we also had architects coming who'd studied architecture decades ago, practiced in countries across the world, but were coming to the same museum as kind of almost sort of where architecture began. The extent to which Stone himself conceived it that way. I mean, he'd be absolutely delighted that was happening, but whether he'd kind of quite thought of it having that kind of pull and being this sort of center of gravity and source of such inspiration for many architects, obviously those associated with postmodernism, but traditionalists, even kind of hardened modernists. I think the Soane Museum has a show on at the moment about Soane and his influence on modernism, which is curious to me because when I was there, we did a show on Soane and his kind of influence and connection to postmodernism. So it's kind of fascinating that an architect can draw those seemingly two opposing schools together. Hawksmoor was another one who managed that.
yeah.
Um, but so yes, I guess there are some of these houses that have become kind of more manifesto over
Mm,
time. But then obviously like something like the House NA, Fujimoto. I mean, it is a proposition, a radical proposition for a fundamentally different way of kind of conceiving interior spaces and of a houses and its occupants' relationship to the external world. And it's one of these houses. You talked about it. Some of them being cold, and undoubtedly they are. I mean, I don't know if that building is cold or not, but certainly in terms of practicality, it really pushes things about as
mhm.
far as you could possibly get. So, but that's as I say, one of the kind of the characteristics of
Yeah.
houses is that they're not if your chief concern is to kind of deliver something that is practical, you tend to go with what's tried and tested with
Mm,
the norms for the time. You don't try to do anything that's too different. So
mm,
there's always that and that's very often on the part of the clients, as we were discussing earlier, to give the architect that freedom to do something a little bit differently, even if there may be knock-on effects.
Have you found, in thinking about and encountering these buildings, that they have, as manifestos, but as examples, precedent, I suppose we would call it normally in design studio, have you found that they have had an impact? Because almost all of them, if not all of the buildings that you pick on, are standalone housing for very wealthy clients. I think that's fair. I don't think maybe there's some who are just moderately incredibly wealthy, but and that's not a criticism at all, of course. But I suppose to be a manifesto, one must intend to be manifest by others at some other point. Have you found examples here where there has been a direct correlation?
Yes, yes. I mean, there are a number of examples. I mean, on the cover of the book is Villa Savoie. We mentioned Palladio. There's Philip Webb's Red House, which kind of spawned a whole kind of arts and craft movement, which has been incredibly influential. There's a number of postmodern examples, maybe less so, less kind of directly, Charles Jenks and Terry Farrell's thematic house. Now the sort of cosmic house is not necessarily, people aren't necessarily designing narrative houses in that way, but in terms of unlocking different ways of thinking about the architectural past and how that has informed architecture more broadly, very, very influential. Sarah Wigglesworth and Jeremy Till's Stock Orchard Street. Again, there aren't many people building houses like that, but in terms of the idea of houses being kind of designed almost according to the sort of sustainability and that agenda, and through the choice of materials and particular design choices, incredibly influential. And then there are others that are maybe more kind of not necessarily dead ends, but haven't had anywhere near the same influence. And for me, kind of this sort of comes back to this way of thinking about the history of architecture, not as this sort of smooth linear thing, but as this almost this kind of root-like form going off in different directions and then kind of doubling back on itself and going ahead and then also coming back. It's a kind of wiggly line with lots of dead ends along the way. There isn't this single narrative of this smooth trajectory, which is what modernism was always about. Ultimately, was seeing almost the kind of the Gothic revival as the kind of, or maybe you can go into neoclassicism as the sort of the first moment of the modern and of every kind of stylistic iteration, part of this journey towards modernist abstraction. It's explicitly not that, but at the same time doesn't chuck away that idea that there is this sort of story of architectural development and of change.
I'd like this idea that it's almost that you're suggesting that the Manifesto House is like a text in a way, and that where perhaps the spatial and aesthetic qualities of the buildings are not replicated, not reproduced. So you mentioned Sarah Wigglesworth's Stock Orchard Street, where it hasn't become model for other people's architecture because it's, big and expensive. But perhaps some of the ideas that underpin it, this kind of alternative materials, alternative construction methods, environmental thinking, and so on, do extract out of that, almost like the building itself is, as I say, is like a text, is composed of words, and other folk can then draw out some of that thinking.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, as you say, despite Sarah and Jeremy's best efforts, there aren't, too many houses built of straw bales or of bags of concrete that are just sort of stacked on top of each other. Maybe there should be, but in terms of its contribution to the broader discourse around sustainability, it's been unbelievably influential. I would say. So I mean, yes, as the house is like a text. I mean, I think that's quite an interesting way of thinking about it. And obviously, that does bring the sort of manifesto and the house together. I have to think about,
Fair
about that.
enough. Fair enough. I just want one more question I've got for you, which is speaking as both the director of the Farrell Centre and as the writer of this book. What does the future of the Manifesto House look like? Have we got manifesto houses emerging now? Where and who by? What are they about?
Yes, I mean, I make a claim at the end of the book that, as we're kind of looking for alternatives, I think different ways of making architecture, of thinking about architecture, of really sort of conceiving what it is that an architect does and what their contribution might be. That actually, the Manifesto House is still an important vehicle for putting forward those alternatives. So one of the 21st century projects is a house in Senegal by the practice Rohe, which is led by Nzinga Umba, a really fascinating architect who works mainly in Senegal, but uh, works between there and the UK, and is also resident elsewhere. And that house is a kind of extraordinary one because in many ways it's relatively modest, but what it has become is this vehicle for the practices, ideas for how to reconnect architecture to the very local, deeply sort of embedded ways of making buildings from materials that are at hand locally, you know, and moving away from building things of steel and concrete to actually looking at the materials that are there, and looking at the qualities that they possess and designing the spaces according to the characteristics of those materials in ways that don't rely on extractive processes of sort of concrete fabrication, that don't then create buildings that need expensive and carbon intensive air conditioning to make habitable. It's reconnecting architecture to some of these practices and ways of making buildings that modernism certainly suppressed. Maybe the very notion of architecture is something that is fundamentally, in the kind of Western canon, is the architecture emerged through the separation of design from building, and architecture was the intellectual pursuit that was ultimately about drawing, and then passing those drawings to someone else to actually build a building. It's actually collapsing that distinction and creating fundamentally new or different forms of architecture that don't force a disconnection between designing and building, that sees the architect as not necessarily at the sort of the top of the chain as perhaps they were historically, and as I think maybe many architects wish was the case now, rather than being a kind of cog in this huge machine. They want to be the kind of the person driving the machine, as maybe they were in the sort of modernist moment of kind of architects, sort of massive preeminence in the sort of constructing literally the architectures of the welfare state in the Western world, for example. But actually, that we don't want to go back to that situation. We want to go probably even further to those pre-architectural ways of making buildings, where there isn't any distinction between designing and making. They actually function together, and Warfida's work, I think, really manifests that idea in a very modest, it's very kind of modest, unassuming, very beautifully designed and thought through, highly elegant use of handling of spaces and use of materials, but doing quietly something I think incredibly radical and transformative, not just that particular building or that for particular context, but for how we think of architecture more broadly. And I think, in that regard, therefore, it is an archetypal manifesto house. It's not just a manifesto for house design or house construction. It's a manifesto for what architecture might potentially become or needs to become in the future.
Fantastic. It's like you designed it. Perfect place to finish on. Thank you so much, Owen.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
My hat, it has 3 corners has my hat, and had it not 3 corners, it would not be my hat. Sung to a traditional Neapolitan melody, and under the title O Mamma Mamma Cara, that wee ditty was taken by Niccolo Paganini and recast, shall we say, as his Carnival of Venice. And that's as close as we're going to get to that, there and then. Owen's The Manifesto House is a banger. Buy it and read. Links to him and the book are in the podcast description. Click, follow, yum yum yum. And thanks for listening.